The Great Betrayal. How the Liberal Party of Canada abandoned the working majority. From Red Book ideals to the captured state. There is a particular species of political fraud that does not announce itself. It does not arrive in the night wearing a mask. It comes dressed in the language of fairness, of progress, of inclusion, and it picks your pocket while shaking your hand. The Liberal Party of Canada has mastered this art over 3 decades, but never more completely, never more brazenly, than in the years between Justin Trudeau's 2015 triumphant return to power and the Mark Carney era now underway. What follows is an accounting, not a partisan attack, but a documented reckoning with the distance between what this party promised the working people of Canada and what it has actually delivered to them. This is not a call to worship at the altar of either the American constitutional framework or the Austrian school of economics. The American Constitution, when genuinely applied, when its architecture of separated powers, enumerated rights, and institutional checks is treated as more than a document of convenience, remains one of the most powerful instruments for constraining state power and protecting individual liberty ever devised. That its institutions have been tested, strained, and at times abused does not diminish the foundational genius of its design. Austrian economics, similarly, contains genuine insight, the price system as an information processor, the danger of central bank credit manipulation, the corrosive effect of moral hazard. But Austrian economics, taken as gospel, is a doctrine with sharp edges that cut the very people its proponents claim to defend. Its prescription of austerity and liquidation has, historically, produced depression, not liberation. The truth lies in the honest application of both frameworks, constitutional accountability and market discipline, tempered by the recognition that governance exists to serve people, not financial abstractions. The Liberals have failed on both counts. They have failed to govern constitutionally, in the sense of transparent, accountable, limited power answerable to the public. And they have failed economically, not because they have intervened too much in markets, but because their interventions have consistently served the connected, the credentialed, and the financially entrenched, while ordinary Canadians absorb the costs. What follows is the evidence. The promise. WHO. The Liberals claim to be the 2006 collapse and the myth of the reformers. The Liberal Party that stumbled from power in January 2006 was a wounded beast. The sponsorship scandal, in which federal money flowed to Liberal-connected advertising firms in Quebec in exchange for little or no work, had exposed a governing culture of entitlement so deep that even loyal Liberals acknowledged it with shame. Under Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, the party had delivered balanced budgets, yes, but it had also gutted social housing investment in the 1990s austerity drive, presided over the systematic dismantling of federal support for affordable housing, and overseen a political culture where party financing and government contracts were functionally interchangeable. The 2006 election defeat, while painful, was arguably deserved. The leadership race that followed produced, eventually, Stéphane Dion and then Michael Ignatieff, neither of whom managed to reconnect the party to the working Canadians who had once viewed it as their natural home. The Liberal Party's platform in the 2006 period still nominally carried commitments to affordable housing, healthcare investment, and social support programs. The rhetoric was of a party that believed in government as a vehicle for shared prosperity. The reality was increasingly a party of the professional class, of Bay Street adjacent policy, of governance as credential. 2015. The return of hope, and the promises that came with it. When Justin Trudeau swept to power in October 2015 with a majority government, the promises he carried were explicit, documented, and directed squarely at working and middle-class Canadians. The Liberal platform committed to raise taxes on the wealthiest 1% to cut taxes for the middle class. It pledged to invest $20 billion in public transit over 10 years and nearly $20 billion more for affordable housing. It promised to replace the conservative universal child care benefit with a scaled Canada Child benefit that would deliver more to lower-income families and nothing to those earning above $200,000 annually. It committed to a new health accord with the provinces. It promised to reduce the employment insurance waiting period. It explicitly framed its entire program around the premise that the Harper decade had hollowed out the economic security of ordinary Canadians, and that a Liberal government would restore it. These were not vague aspirations. They were numbered commitments, 353 of them, tracked by Laval University researchers throughout Trudeau's first mandate. Academic analysis by the journal Social Policy and Administration documented that the Liberal platform drifted leftward to resemble NDP positions in order to attract voters who demanded more social investment after 10 years of Conservative government. The party understood what the electorate wanted. It articulated it clearly. And then, over the following decade, it systematically betrayed it, not through inaction alone, but through active policy choices that produced the opposite of what was promised. 2. The immigration catastrophe, scale without capacity. The numbers that broke the country. Let us be precise about what happened, because the scale of the Liberal government's immigration mismanagement is without precedent in modern Canadian history. Between 2014 and 2023, Canada admitted approximately 2.98 million new permanent residents and issued roughly 4.4 million new study and work permits, according to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada administrative data. The population grew by 3.2% in 2023 alone, approximately 1.27 million people, the equivalent of adding a city the size of metropolitan Calgary in a single year, after expanding at near record speed every year since 2016. The consequences were not unforeseen. They were foreseen and ignored. Documents obtained through access to information requests revealed that federal public servants warned the government as early as 2022 that large immigration increases could affect housing affordability and services. IRCC analyzed the potential effects and warned the deputy minister that housing construction had not kept up with population growth, and the government pressed forward anyway, announcing plans to stabilize permanent resident targets at 500,000 annually by 2025, nearly double the 260,411 permanent residents who arrived in 2014. In the fall of 2022, the government announced its intention to increase annual permanent resident targets from 405,000 to 465,000 by 2022, en route to 500,000 by 2024. The rental market collapsed under the weight of this demand. Canada's purpose-built rental vacancy rate fell to 1.5% in 2023, the lowest in the 35-year CMHC series. Average advertised rents rose 8% year-over-year. The Bank of Canada quantified the squeeze directly. Rent inflation reached 8.2% in October 2023, a 40-year high, with the bank's own staff linking the spike to record newcomer inflows. A joint Statistics Canada and IRCC study found that municipalities experiencing larger increases in newcomer inflows recorded an average 11% jump in median monthly rents over the same 5-year span. Real GDP per capita declined in 5 of the past 6 quarters and sat 2.5% below pre-pandemic levels, despite the country's total output growing. The immigrant surge inflated gross GDP while diluting economic output per person. The government knew. It acted anyway. The internal documents are damning. Statistics Canada reported that temporary and permanent immigration accounted for almost 98% of Canada's population growth in 2023. The government's own immigration consultation report found that when stakeholders were asked to rank investment priorities to support increased immigration, housing was the first choice of 89% of respondents, healthcare services came second at 76%. The government had real-time data that its housing infrastructure was nowhere near capable of absorbing the volumes it was approving, and it continued approving them. The non-permanent resident surge was particularly reckless. Historically, non-permanent residents comprised 2 to 3% of Canada's population. By the fourth quarter of 2024, they had reached 7.6%. Of the 1.4 million new non-permanent residents admitted between 2022 and 2024, around 400,000 entered as students, many enrolled in low-quality private colleges that have since been characterized as effectively operating as immigration pathways, and another 300,000 to 400,000 found employment in lower-wage sectors including food service and retail. The international student population ballooned from roughly 240,000 in 2011 to nearly 900,000 by late 2023. These students, concentrated in urban rental markets, drove rental prices into crisis conditions for the Canadian-born young people who could not compete with their pooled incomes. It is important to note what this is not. It is not an argument against immigration. Canada has long depended on newcomers and continues to do so, given an aging population and persistently low birth rates. The argument is against the Liberal government's specific, documented decision to dramatically accelerate immigration volumes beyond any reasonable assessment of absorptive capacity, in housing, healthcare, and infrastructure, while suppressing internal analysis that identified those limits and then responding to the consequences with the one tool it always reaches for: more spending financed by more taxes. By late 2024, with public support for high immigration levels at its lowest point since 1998 to 58% of Canadians telling the Environics Institute there was too much immigration, the government finally announced reductions. The damage, however, was already done. 3. The justice system inversions: criminals out, citizens disarmed. The revolving door justice system. While the Trudeau government aggressively expanded immigration beyond infrastructure capacity, it simultaneously dismantled the sentencing framework that had kept violent and repeat offenders behind bars. The pattern is documented, statutory, and inexcusable. Bill C-75, passed in 2019, codified a principle of restraint in the criminal code requiring judges to release accused offenders at the earliest reasonable opportunity under least onerous conditions. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the Winnipeg Police Chief, Ontario's Solicitor General, premiers across the country, and opposition parties from the NDP to the Conservatives lined up to warn that this legislative change was creating a revolving door through which repeat violent offenders cycled in and out of custody. Their warnings were not abstract. Police officers were documenting individual offenders committing crimes while on bail, being charged, being released on bail, and committing the same crimes again, in some cases within days. Bill C-5, passed under the same government, expanded the availability of conditional sentences, allowing some convicted criminals to serve time under house arrest instead of incarceration. The Conservative Party's own documentation from Statistics Canada showed violent crime in Canada increased 50% since 2015, including a 116% increase in gun crimes over the same period. Total firearms crime rose 131%. Extortion rose 330%. These are not Conservative talking points, they are Statistics Canada figures cited in parliamentary record, confirmed by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police in its repeated calls for urgent bail reform. Ontario Provincial Police Constable Grzegorz Piershala was fatally shot in December 2022 by a man who was out on bail after being charged with multiple prior offences. His death became a catalyst for premier-level demands that Ottawa reform its bail regime. Ottawa responded with months of delay, partial measures that left the principle of restraint intact, and ultimately, only under the Carney government in October 2025, introduced Bill C-14, the Bail and Sentencing Reform Act. Justice Minister Sean Fraser himself acknowledged that a small number of offenders were perpetrating an outsized number of crimes, coming in and out of the justice system, as if it were a revolving door. He was describing the direct product of his own party's legislation his government had defended for years against mounting evidence of its human cost. The Canadian Bar Association, hardly a law and order hardliner, described the situation bluntly. Repeat offenders committing low-level offences were racking up multiple charges in short periods, released into communities with limited supports, creating inordinate burdens on the justice system. Meanwhile, violent repeat offenders, the second category the CBA identified, were being routed through a bail regime that prioritized constitutional minimalism over victim protection. The system was not accidentally broken. It was deliberately designed this way by a government that framed leniency as progressivism and treated public safety as a secondary concern to the rights of the accused. The gun grab that targets the wrong people. The Liberal government's firearms policy represents one of the most stunning examples of political misdirection in modern Canadian history, an aggressive, sustained campaign against licensed, background-checked, law-abiding gun owners, people who are, per Statistics Canada itself, remarkably nonviolent, conducted simultaneously with the bail reforms described above that made it systematically easier for criminals to remain on the street. The trajectory is clear. The 2020 order in council immediately prohibited approximately 1,500 models of semi-automatic rifles by executive decree, without parliamentary vote, in the aftermath of a mass shooting in Nova Scotia that involved an illegally obtained firearm. Bill C-71 in 2019 had already created what critics characterized as a backdoor firearms registry. Then came Bill C-21, receiving royal assent on December 15, 2023, the centerpiece of the Liberal gun control agenda. The bill codified a national freeze on the sale, purchase, and transfer of handguns that had been in effect since October 2022 by order in council. It rendered approximately 1 million legal firearms, valued at over $1 billion, effectively worthless to their legal owners, who can no longer sell them and must surrender them without compensation upon death. The Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights and the Conservative opposition argued, with considerable evidence, that this freeze targeted precisely the people it should not target: holders of possession and acquisition licenses who have passed RCMP background checks, completed mandatory safety training, and are subject to continuous eligibility monitoring. Statistics Canada itself has noted that firearms used in homicides were rarely legal firearms used by their legal owners in good standing. Just 23 PAL holders were among the 686 people accused of homicide in 2022. These are the people the Liberals went after. The actual source of firearm violence in Canadian cities: illegal guns smuggled across the Canada-US border, firearms in the hands of gang members with no licenses whatsoever, was addressed with words and comparatively modest border enforcement spending. The asymmetry is not accidental. It is ideological. The Liberal government's internal documents, as reported in the press, suggest that firearms policy was driven not primarily by public safety calculations but by cultural and political objectives: the desired transformation of Canada's relationship with civilian gun ownership. The law-abiding hunter in northern Manitoba, the competitive shooter in Saskatoon, the rural homeowner who keeps a licensed handgun for protection, they are visible, taxable, and compliant with law. They make easy political targets. The gang member importing Glock pistols through Buffalo makes no paperwork and pays no compliance costs. He is substantially harder to inconvenience. The Liberals chose convenience. IV. The Carney problem, the captured state in plain sight. When the regulator and the investor are the same person. Mark Carney's arrival as Prime Minister in March 2025 did not represent a departure from the Liberal trajectory described above. It represented its logical conclusion. For the first time in Canadian history, the office of Prime Minister was occupied by a man who had spent the previous decade as a senior executive of one of the world's largest private equity firms, Brookfield Asset Management, managing over $700 billion in assets, while simultaneously serving as chair of the Liberal Party's Economic Growth Task Force advising the government, and chairing global bodies setting the framework for green transition finance. The conflicts of interest that followed from this are not speculation. They are parliamentary record. Carney's ethics disclosure revealed holdings in the Brookfield Global Transition Fund, a $15 billion vehicle he personally structured and raised capital for, investing in carbon capture, nuclear energy services, solar power, and infrastructure. When he became Prime Minister, his Brookfield stock options, deferred shares, and carried interest entitlements were placed in a blind trust, administered not by an independent officer of Parliament, but by his own Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom serve at his pleasure. House of Commons Ethics Committee testimony in November 2025 revealed that the two administrators of this screen had no knowledge of the specific assets constituting the Brookfield Global Transition Fund, the very fund from which Carney's performance pay, potentially in the tens of millions of dollars, would eventually flow. Brookfield's own chief operating officer, Justin Bieber, confirmed under oath that if Carney had sold his Brookfield assets outright rather than placing them in trust, there would be no conflict to manage. He chose not to. This was legal. It was also the choice of a man who intended to remain financially entangled with the firm whose investment interests would be most directly affected by the policies of the government he was about to lead. The concrete manifestations followed with startling speed. In April 2025, the Carney government announced $1 billion in federal funding for heat pump programs. Brookfield Infrastructure owns Enercare, an Ontario company that explicitly advertises heat pump retrofits and government rebate programs as part of its services. In October 2024, while Carney was simultaneously chairing Brookfield Asset Management and serving as chair of the Liberal Party's Economic Growth Task Force, the UK's Telegraph newspaper reported that Carney had personally lobbied the British cabinet for heat pump programs, with HomeServe, a Brookfield-affiliated company, acknowledging that Carney was working on our behalf in government. Brookfield had also submitted an unsolicited proposal to Ottawa for $10 billion in federal funding as part of a proposed $50 billion Maple Fund, soliciting capital from Canadian pension funds for investments in housing, data centers, nuclear energy, and infrastructure, all sectors where Brookfield held positions. Government officials confirmed the proposal was not requested. Brookfield brought it to Ottawa unprompted, while Carney occupied dual roles. The carbon credit architecture completes the picture. Brookfield invested $300 million in carbon capture company Entropy in March 2022, when Carney was vice chair. In December 2023, the Federal Canada Growth Fund, a public instrument, invested $200 million in Entropy. Entropy subsequently received a carbon credit purchase agreement it described as a global first in compliance markets, guaranteeing long-term demand for its credits. The sequence is: Carney helps design the policy environment. Brookfield makes the investment. Public money follows. The ethics commissioner himself stated on the record that it was clear Mr. Carney's future compensation is tied to the success of Brookfield. This is the captured state that the captured state documents, not captured by bureaucrats, not captured by ideologues, but captured by a man of extraordinary financial sophistication who has arranged the machinery of public office around the investment portfolio of a private equity firm. The Austrian school would diagnose this as the inevitable product of expansive government and central banking, the state as the prize for those who can seize it. The progressive analysis identifies a more specific mechanism: inadequate conflict of interest law, a culture that treats the revolving door as a credential, and a prime minister who made a legal but deeply improper choice to govern while financially entangled with the interests he regulates. Both diagnoses have merit. The Austrian insight, that concentrated state power creates concentrated incentives for capture, is not wrong. The American constitutional design, with its separation of powers and its distrust of concentrated authority, was built precisely to prevent this. A prime minister who structured investment vehicles, lobbied foreign governments on behalf of his employer, and then assumed control of the regulatory framework governing those investments would face, in a properly functioning constitutional order, either mandatory divestiture or immediate removal from office. Canada's Conflict of Interest Act was, as the Ethics Committee concluded, insufficient to manage a prime minister of Carney's financial complexity. Versus the tax solution to self-created problems. A government that spends, borrows, and taxes, in that order. The Liberal government's response to every crisis it has created, housing unaffordability, overwhelmed healthcare, strained infrastructure, has followed a consistent and increasingly transparent pattern: announce spending, increase taxes, defer accountability. The 2024 federal budget illustrated this with unusual clarity. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland tabled a budget projecting a $40 billion deficit while announcing $52.9 billion in new spending over 5 years. The cost to service Canada's growing national debt had reached a point where, in the 2024-25 fiscal year, the government would spend more servicing its debt than on healthcare, $54.1 billion in interest charges versus health transfer payments. Carrying the debt was projected to cost $64.3 billion by 2028-29, more than double what Ottawa transfers to provinces through equalization. To offset some of this spending, the government raised the capital gains inclusion rate from 1/2 to 2/3 on gains above $250,000 for individuals and on all capital gains for corporations and most trusts. The government characterized this as tax fairness for the wealthy, and in its narrowest application, the characterization is defensible. The change primarily affects individuals with average incomes of $1.4 million. But the CPA Canada analysis exposed the downstream consequences that the government elided. The change fell disproportionately on small business owners, doctors operating through medical corporations, farmers, cottage owners, and entrepreneurs for whom a capital gains event is not an annual occurrence but a one-time life event, the sale of a business built over decades, an estate settlement, a retirement plan. The number of businesses in Canada had stalled since early 2023. Business insolvencies were higher than before the pandemic. The government's own former advisor, Robert Asselin of the Business Council of Canada, described a government addicted to spending that had no tools left but tax increases. The underlying arithmetic is inescapable. The Liberal government created massive demand pressures through immigration policy, failed to build the housing and infrastructure to accommodate those pressures, watched affordability collapse, and then proposed to solve the revenue gap through capital gains increases that hit the entrepreneurial class, precisely the people whose investment and risk-taking would be required to build the homes, the clinics, and the transit infrastructure the country desperately needs. It is a policy framework that consumes its own seed corn. The deportation doctrine. Different rules for different people. The question of whether immigrants who commit serious crimes should be deported is not a fringe position. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a nonpartisan think tank, documented in early 2026 that Canada has become an outlier among peer countries in its deportation practices. Germany and Sweden deport failed asylum seekers to Afghanistan. Many countries in the Americas have deported Haitians. Canada, by contrast, has for years maintained blanket deferrals and moratoria on removals to countries like these, a practice whose continuity under the current government remains genuinely unclear. The Council on Foreign Relations reported that the Canadian government has historically been slow to deport failed asylum claimants, with some remaining in Canada without documentation. The government itself acknowledged in 2024 that as many as 500,000 undocumented people could be living in the country. Internal government documents, as reported through access to information requests, have shown the government exploring options to regularize those without immigration status, an official euphemism for providing a pathway to legal residency for people who have overstayed or violated the terms of their entry. What emerges from the aggregate of these policies is a system of incentive structures that a working Canadian rightly finds obscene. A licensed gun owner who fills out the wrong paperwork faces criminal charges. A repeat violent offender released under the principle of restraint is back on the street within days. A failed asylum seeker who has been ordered removed remains in Canada for years, potentially indefinitely, and may receive healthcare, housing assistance, and social welfare while their case winds through an overwhelmed system. The 2007 Auditor General of Canada found that the CBSA had lost track of 41,000 individuals who had been ordered deported. The oversight infrastructure for removal orders has not been meaningfully strengthened in the years since. None of this is an argument for inhumanity toward people who have genuinely fled violence and persecution. Canada's refugee obligations under international law are real and should be honored. But the Liberal government has allowed the humanitarian framework to become a mechanism for systemic non-enforcement, while simultaneously prosecuting law-abiding Canadians for firearms compliance irregularities, and taxing small business owners to fund the social services absorbed by a population whose entry was never matched to absorptive capacity. The ordinary Canadian, playing by every rule, is held to a standard of compliance that no other actor in this system is asked to meet. What honest governance would look like. The Austrian school's prescriptions: abolish the central bank, restore the gold standard, eliminate fractional reserve banking, have been field-tested and have failed, most catastrophically in the interwar period when gold standard rigidity turned the 1929 crash into the Great Depression, and bank liquidations wiped out the savings of exactly the working people the doctrine claimed to liberate. The historical record, documented by economic historians from Barry Eichengreen to Douglas Irwin, is not kind to the gold standard as a policy tool for a modern, complex economy. Hayek's insight about price signals and dispersed knowledge has genuine merit. His prescription of liquidation as the cure for malinvestment does not, because the cost of liquidation falls most heavily on those with the fewest resources to absorb it. The American constitutional framework, by contrast, offers durable wisdom that Canada's parliamentary system consistently fails to implement. The architecture of separated powers, an executive constrained by an independent legislature, a judiciary capable of striking down legislation that violates fundamental rights, an ethos of enumerated rather than implied governmental authority, was built by people who understood that concentrated power produces concentrated corruption. Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It does not have an institutional culture that treats the Charter as a genuine constraint on government conduct rather than a list of aspirations. A government that creates a 500,000-person annual immigration target without consulting Parliament, that freezes handgun sales by order in council rather than by legislated authority, that governs through ministerial decree rather than parliamentary accountability, is not operating within a constitutional framework worthy of the name. What would honest governance look like? It would look like immigration levels set by Parliament, after transparent assessment of absorptive capacity, with clear accountability when those assessments prove wrong. It would look like mandatory divestiture, not blind trusts administered by political appointees, for senior public officials with financial conflicts. It would look like firearms policy designed around evidence of what actually reduces violent crime, which the research consistently shows is targeted enforcement against illegal trafficking networks rather than restrictions on licensed owners. It would look like a bail system that treats victims' security as at least as important as the procedural rights of repeat offenders. And it would look like a government that, when it needs more revenue, asks first whether it has created the problems requiring that revenue, before presenting the bill to the entrepreneurs, farmers, and small business owners who built the economy it is now consuming. Conclusion. The Long Ledger. The Liberal Party of Canada that governed from 1993 to 2006 was imperfect, scandal-prone, and fiscally ruthless in the name of balancing budgets that balanced on the backs of the provinces. But it was, in some essential way, a party that still understood its governing coalition included ordinary Canadians, workers, families, people of modest means who expected government to function without embarrassing them internationally or plundering them systematically. The Liberal Party that returned to power in 2015 and has governed since is something different. It is a party that has internalized the language of fairness while practicing the logic of capture. It speaks of the middle class while designing policy for the financial sector. It prosecutes gun owners while releasing repeat offenders. It floods the housing market with demand it cannot supply, then taxes the people who might build supply. It governs through the revolving door, and in Mark Carney, it has installed at its apex a man whose entire career is the revolving door made flesh. The Captured State, the title of the book that informs this essay's examination of the Carney era, is not a metaphor. It is a description of a documented structural reality, that the line between the regulatory state and the financial interests it regulates has, in the liberal era, been erased. Not because of some inevitable logic of government, as Austrian theory would have it, but because a series of specific human beings made specific choices, choices that were legal, choices that were politically advantageous, and choices that were morally indefensible. The working Canadian who cannot afford rent in a city their parents bought a house in 30 years ago, who watches the news and sees a repeat violent offender out on bail for the fourth time, who fills out federal firearms paperwork for a rifle they used to hunt deer while a gang member's illegally imported Glock appears at another downtown shooting, that Canadian has not been failed by government in the abstract. They have been failed by this government, these policies, these choices. The ledger is long, the debt is real, and it is time to call it what it is. Sources and citations. The following sources were independently consulted in the preparation of this essay. All factual claims are drawn from two or more of these independent sources. On immigration and housing. 1. CBC.